The Tree Full of Bones. Written by Deeify. Brought to you by Midnight Pasta. I was only 12 years old when I first discovered it. My family and I had a very fun, and as my dad liked to call it, healthy activity. Every other weekend we went for a hike in the mountains that surrounded our town. Due to living in a very mountainous area, hiking was a very popular form of recreation for the townsfolk. There were dozens upon dozens of trails to choose from, so my parents liked to choose a different one every time we ventured out. Our latest choice, however, proved to be our last as a family. I was a middle child with a younger brother and older sister. My parents liked to put us in charge of picking the trail we'd have our little adventure on, and it was my little brother's turn. "All right, little man," my father shouted to my brother from the computer screen. "Here are your two choices. Rattlesnake Gulch Trail or Neff's Canyon Trail." My brother looked up from his Game Boy. Well, I don't want to get us all killed by rattlesnakes, so Snuff's Canyon, I guess," he remarked while immediately resuming his game. Dad let out a humorous scoff. "It's Neff's Canyon, buddy," he said while motioning to my mom to see the pictures. After packing our supplies and being yelled at only 6 times by my sister for packing things incorrectly, we made our way out. We had made it roughly halfway through the trail into a more densely wooded area, which made visibility ahead a little more difficult. Many of the overgrown trees had rooted themselves into the trail, as I remember tripping over several roots and scraping my forehead against many of the overgrown branches. It was here that I asked my father if we could take a quick restroom break. Without a word, he nodded while taking a swig from his water bottle. I walked off the trail, brushing through the dense foliage. I wanted to get enough distance to make sure my sister couldn't see me pee. Weird thought, I know, but as a child, I was very sensitive to that kind of thing. As I finished up, I began turning to walk back to my family. I noticed something strange through the dense trees. One tree among the many stood out. It was much darker in color and seemed a lot more dried out and unhealthy. My curiosity got the best of me, and I walked over to inspect this poor tree. As I arrived at the tree, scratch marks covered the entirety of it. It was dry with very few branches and no leaves. The dark color was almost disturbing, like something you would see on the set of a horror film. It was dead. "Bummer," I said to myself as I began walking back to my family. As I turned to leave, I caught a quick glimpse of something no one could prepare for. On the side of the tree, almost towards the top, I could see a hole in the bark. Assuming it may be some kind of animal nest, I curiously walked around to look in. A frown came across my face as I looked into the tree. It was hollowed out much more than I first realized and was full of bones. Dozens and dozens of bones. It was dark and I couldn't see how far down the pile went, but there were many. I wasn't afraid at first because the first thought that entered my mind was that these were animal bones. Maybe some sick kids killed animals for fun, or maybe this was the work of a bear. "Damn!" I exclaimed as the thought of being in a bear's territory startled me. I began to turn to walk away when something caught my eye. Inside the pile of bones, I could see a more smooth surface among the pile. My eyes squinted as I looked closer. My better judgment was not in play as I walked closer. My curiosity got the best of me. I don't know why I did what I did, but I reached my hand in to touch it. It wasn't a flat surface. It was curved, and my eyes lit up as I realized what this might be. I felt a fright I had never experienced before as I dug my hand into the pile of bones to pull out what I had originally feared this could be. My fears were correct. Slowly from the pile of dried bones, a human skull began to appear in my hand. I stood in fright, staring at the dead human skull. "Dad! Dad, help!" I yelled, continuing to stare at what I was holding. I heard my dad in the distance through the dense trees, but couldn't understand what he said. "Dad! Come here now!" I tried yelling with all I had. I dropped the skull back into the pile of bones and slowly backed away. My dad broke through the thick foliage, revealing himself. "What's up, buddy?" he said with a smirk. I said nothing. I simply pointed to the tree, not letting my eyes off of it. I could see the look of confusion on my dad's face even from the corner of my eye. He walked towards the tree with an almost sarcastic look on his face at this point. That look faded away fast as he peered into the hollowed out tree. "Holy shit," my dad began. "You guys, let's go!" my mom yelled from the other side of the brush. Slowly, my dad turned to look at me. I'll never forget that moment, as my dad and I just stared at each other in shock. A full police investigation was done. All 147 bones in that tree were human. A total of 12 separate people were reported to be housed in that tree, with mainly the larger bones and skulls being kept. This appeared to be the work of a serial killer. Through DNA testing, many unsolved disappearances were answered. Someone was preying on hikers on that trail. The tree was destroyed by the local authorities. I retold my story over and over again to several detectives. The murders remain unsolved. Until now. 10 years later, I am now an adult and living on my own. While traumatizing as a child, the day of my discovery has been growing further and further from my mind. I purchased a house with my wife closer to downtown. It might be a little bit psychological from that day, but a more urban living style was what offered me safety. "That one," my wife yelled from our computer desk in an almost familiar scenario. I walked over to the computer to gaze at the screen. It was our first anniversary and we wanted to do something special. My wife had picked a cabin out for us to spend the weekend in and was grinning in excitement as I browsed the photo gallery. It was a beautiful cabin by the lake and the price was right. "Book it," I said with a smile. She did just that, and for the rest of the week, conversation filled the house with our excitement for the upcoming weekend. The pictures didn't know justice as we arrived at our cabin. A mist hovered over the bank of the lake as dawn ended. We made sure to make it up there early to not waste a moment of our time there. An almost primal fear came over me as I wasn't prepared for what my wife said later that morning. "Let's go for a hike today," she said as she cooked our morning eggs. I looked at her with eyes wide open. She looked at me as if she knew what my reaction would be before even asking the question. I'm sorry, I knew that would be a tough question, but I think it might be good for you, she said confidently. Ugh, I comically replied, attempting to cover up my nervousness. I know what happened when you were little, she said, raising an eyebrow at me. But I think this is a chance for you to come to terms. What happened was miles away from here and a decade ago. I'm betting a nice, safe hike will bring you some closure. Halfway through our breakfast, I finally relented. Okay, I sternly said. But if you turn out to be the murderer, I want a divorce. We smiled at each other as we finished our breakfast. A couple hours later, we were packed and ready to go for our hike. I'm happy to report the hike was largely uneventful. It was relaxing, and we put in a lot of quality time in the few hours we were gone. No other human was in sight during the trail, which gave us a sense that this was our adventure together. It was great until something caught my eye. As we walked back down the trail to end our adventure, a familiar sight hit my eyes. I pulled a classic double take as I spotted it in the distance. A dark, dead-looking tree peered back at me through the forest. We didn't stop our descent to the foot of the mountain, yet I kept my eyes trained on it. As we approached the entrance to the trail, I shrugged my sighting off as my mind getting to me. After all, dead trees aren't exactly uncommon. I laid in my bed that night, staring at the ceiling. My wife was fast asleep in exhaustion from today's hike. My mind was reeling with the thought of what I had seen. This couldn't happen again, could it? Could this serial killer be striking again, preying on hikers? My curiosity got the best of me, yet again. I slowly slid out of bed to not wake my wife up. I quietly got dressed to head out and finally put this fear to rest. I let out a heavy exhale as I stared at the entrance to the trail. With flashlight in hand, I began walking. Every sound from the forest was accompanied by a startling whip of my flashlight. I placed my hand securely on the handle of the knife I made sure to attach to my belt. The darkness through the forest was eerily silent as I flung my flashlight left and right in confusion. The nighttime atmosphere was throwing me off with everything looking different. I pulled out my phone to load up a map of the trail. This was not necessary after all, as I placed my flashlight under my arm to retrieve my phone. I saw it. The dark hunk of tree was right in the middle of the light, almost as if it was beckoning me towards it. I stared at it for several seconds. My frame straightened up as I let out another large exhale. It was time to put my fears to rest. I began walking towards the tree. I was stopped in my tracks as I heard the tree branches crackling in the thick forest just to the right of the tree. I ducked in cover while attempting to block the light from my flashlight with my palm. I was able to hit the off switch as I cowered between two large bushes. More limbs crackled as audible footsteps began echoing from the forest. Something was coming. The forest around me was lit up in a haze of gray from the moonlight. I looked back at the trail, contemplating making a run for it. If whatever this was that was breaking through the forest was a bear or mountain lion, I wouldn't make it very far if it heard me, though. I stood my ground. The cracks of the branches became louder as I saw the trees begin to separate. Clunk. Something fell to the ground from the trees. I couldn't tell what it was, but it landed directly at the base of the blackened trunk. A low groan was heard from the thick branches it just fell from, followed by a raspy growl. I ducked down further into the bushes, realizing I was having an animal encounter and had to keep out of sight as to not be attacked. I'm not sure if the term animal is correct for the actual encounter I had next. Something came to retrieve its prize. The dense leaves began to part again. A large, claw-like hand came from the trees, grabbing what was dropped to the ground. A form started to emerge. Its giant body must have been 15 feet tall. Its limbs were stretched unimaginably long. The body of this creature was covered in hair, while its arms and legs were completely hairless. Talon-like claws stretched from its bony arms as it lifted up its prize. The form of a human began to appear as it was lifted by the ankle. I covered my mouth almost instinctively, trying desperately not to make noise in the eerily quiet forest. I watched, terrified, as the creature grasped its hands around the entirety of the victim's body. With almost an effortless pull, it tore the leg off the victim and began eating it, with the rest of the body falling to the ground. I don't know how much time passed as I watched this thing dying on its meal. I couldn't move. I shouldn't move. I made the decision to lay in wait and hope the creature finished its midnight snack and moved on. It wasted none of its meal, as I could see it tearing every piece of meat and flesh from the bones with its jagged, sharp teeth. As I look up at the creature's face, its toothy mouth covered most of its head with small, shiny eyes just above a flat, almost skeletal nose. After making short work of its meal, all that lay left were a pile of bones. Through the moonlight, I could see the bones of its victim. It had devoured the smaller bones, leaving the larger ones intact. My childhood fears were realized as I watched it conduct what I could only call a ritual. It began picking up the bones, one by one, examining each one as if it were oddly studying them. After a long examination of each bone, it put the bones into the tree. I could not see where the gap in the tree was from my angle, but I knew the bones were being collected into a hollowed out tree, just like what I saw 10 years ago. A light breeze filled the air as I continued to stare in horror at this creature. Once the bones were secured in their hiding spot, it began to move back into the trees. I let out a quiet sigh of relief. It stopped. With its skeletal nose in the air, it began sniffing. My fear returned as it slowly turned its head to me. It knew I was there. I've never seen anything take off so quickly as this thing did towards me. I panicked as I shined my light directly at the creature. The light seemingly disoriented it as it covered its eyes and flung past me. I began running down the trail as quickly as I could, desperately trying to grab my knife. "Damn it!" I yelled as I tripped over a rock and began tumbling down the trail. I landed on my back as I came to a stop from my tumble. My adrenaline was too high to feel the pain as I pulled out my knife, pointing it in the direction I had just fallen from. Silence. The night sky was eerily quiet. After panning my surroundings for a few seconds, I got myself up and ran. I don't know how I ran so far, but I had finally made it to our cabin. I slammed the door tight as I pressed my body against the door, locking the deadbolt. I quickly walked to my kitchen sink window that was facing the direction of where I had just come from. Nothing. The forest in front of me was quiet, almost too quiet. My shoulders began to droop as my fear lessened. I had escaped this monster. I began walking back to the living room, still in shock from what just occurred. I stood in the middle of the room, staring at the fireplace that lit the room up in an orange hue. I lifted my head up from my empty gaze as I heard a cracking outside. My fear returned as I crouched my body, slowly walking towards the living room window. I peeked through the blinds. I shot back in fright as all I could see was the furry body pressed up against the window and sliding across. It was here. I ran to the bedroom to get my wife. "Wake up! Wake up!" I yelled in fright. Her eyes shot wide open at the sudden startle. "What? What the hell are you doing?" she yelled. "There's a creature outside and it tried to attack me. We have to get out of here now." I screamed as I ran to the door. She shot straight up and jumped out of bed. I ran to the kitchen to desperately look for the car key. I was stopped in my tracks by a low growl coming from in front of me. I slowly looked up to the kitchen window. The entirety of the window was covered by the creature's face. It was just staring at me with those cold black eyes. Its sharp, long teeth seemed larger than before as drool dripped from the points of them. We stared at each other for several seconds. My wife walked in and saw my motionless gaze. She turned to look at what I could possibly be staring at. She let out a blood-curdling scream at the sight in front of her. The creature roared in rage and disappeared from the window. Scratching could be heard outside as the creature was looking for a way into the cabin. Roars of frustration could be heard paired with crashing sounds and more scratching. My wife and I held each other in fright. "We have to wait until it's in the back," I whispered. "Once we hear it back there, we need to quietly go out the front door and get to the car." She nodded with eyes wide open. We listened for several more minutes as the creature shuffled around the cabin. Finally, it made it to the back door. My wife and I looked at each other and began quietly walking towards the front door. As I unlocked the deadbolt, a loud creaking was heard from behind us. The monster had bent the back door down almost in half. This time, I let out a scream and began frantically opening the door. I pushed my wife through as soon as it was open. She ran to the car and I slammed the door shut. I saw through the small window in the door the creature made it through. It was tearing the cabin apart in rage, tossing furniture and digging its large claws into the walls. I ran to the car and jumped in the front seat. "Go, go, go, go!" my wife yelled from the passenger seat. I turned the ignition, starting the car. A loud crash was heard. The creature had barreled into the front door, taking out the entire door frame. It landed with a thud at the bottom of the entryway stairs and flailed its long and bony limbs to regain balance. Without a word, I threw the car into drive and took off. I could see in my rearview mirror the creature giving chase. I hit the gas pedal hard as the engine wailed. I kept my eye in the mirror as the creature began to fade into the darkness behind us. It was gone. The trip back home was silent. Nothing was said until we got home. We tried desperately to put together what had just happened. She looked at me in shock as I told her about the tree and what the creature had done with its victim's remains. I've thought about going to the authorities with what happened, but me finding 2 trees full of human bones, I don't think they would buy that. More so, my story of the large creature that filled those trees, even more unbelievable. We lost the money from the deposit on the cabin due to the damages, and we're being sued for the rest of the amount. Like I give a shit. I'm just happy to be alive. That we are alive after what occurred. I've not heard even a single other report of a creature like this, or even similar to what I encountered. I wonder, were we the lucky ones? And the only ones to ever escape this thing? I will never go hiking again. I warn you, if you do, and you come across a black, dark, dead-looking tree, leave immediately. I wish I had never found that tree full of bones.